Good evening, my friends. We are continuing running through the essence of the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. He actually says explained by Paramahansa Yogananda as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. We make his name as small as possible in the book. I myself have at various times suggested that perhaps we should make it easier to read, but the designs always come out like that. Okay, so we are on chapter 17. Not quite yet. I have to turn back for a moment. Let's start with a prayer and then we'll go forward. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us with deep intuition that we may read this holy scripture and feel heart, mind, and spirit the true consciousness behind these words, the power that has made this scripture live century after century after century with the fresh ability to inspire us anew to greater zeal for God realization. Guide us, bless us, enlighten us. Om, peace. Amen. So we were finishing up chapter 4 of the Gita, and there are 2 more verses without commentary. So just because I've been reading all the verses, I'll finish. Chapter 4, verse 41. O winner of true wealth, Arjuna, one who has dissolved all his karmas in oneness with God and has obliterated his every doubt by wisdom, becomes completely self-possessed, ego-free. No further action can entangle him. Oh my, don't we love that as a promise? Just such a glorious, it has the word obliterated. I love the word. It's a sort of onomatopoeia, obliterated. Obliterated his every doubt by wisdom. We may not think of ourselves as doubters in any fundamental sense, the way Swami described it with such intense suffering. But whenever I have felt uneasy and have introspected, meditated deeply enough to try to find out what I'm uneasy about, it's always that I don't trust God. That, all the other times before, God was in charge, and whatever it was worked out as it was supposed to work out. This time, I'm not so sure. So to actually obliterate every doubt, this is the relaxation of the sage. This is the fourth and highest caste of the priest. When Swamiji defines each of the 4 castes, Shudra, Vaishya, Kshatriya, and Brahmin, and he talks about how each one alleviates suffering. The Shudra alleviates his own suffering by dulling his consciousness, drinking, overeating, oversleeping. You just become dull, and then it doesn't bother you as much. I'm sure all of us have all the castes in us, and all of us have examples of people who don't really seem to suffer that much because they just dull their consciousness down. The Vaishya controls his suffering by trying to control the world around him. He gets money, he gets power, he gets influence, he gets position, he gets everything in line so that he's going to be safe. And, how well does that work for you? It works for a while, but not endlessly. The Kshatriya tries to deal with suffering by controlling himself. The Vaishya, after going through the Vaishya level and realizing that the world is uncontrollable, one directs one's willpower toward mastering my own inner impulses. And the Brahmin the priest, which is what that represents, realizes that there is no such thing as suffering, because everything happens by the will of God. And why would I resist the will of God? Why would I feel that anything that happens, no matter what it appears to be, everything is guided by the divine for the ultimate salvation of all creatures? And all suffering is just a play of light and shadow, that we have been drawn into Maya. So it's a wonderful way. So when we obliterate our every doubt by wisdom, we become completely self-possessed, which is to say, nothing can shake us from our inner bliss. Swami used to talk about that a lot. He said, I refuse to allow anything to take away my peace. And you can put that out as a theoretical idea, and you can sometimes suppress your anxieties, but to genuinely, I'll use Master's magnificent phrase, to stand unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds, comes to us when we have obliterated all doubts. And we know, and we've obliterated all doubts by wisdom. And that wisdom is only God is real. And then therefore, all of this, as I say, is just a play of shadow and light. And without, therefore, not having an ego, not having a separate sense of individuality that has to be protected from the flow of the divine energy, I can no longer be entangled. No further action can entangle him. So even then, if he acts, he can't become entangled. He's just moving with the way God intends him to move. There was something very, very interesting about Swamiji that I gradually came to perceive. Because I have an active mind, and I can sort of think about consequences and analyze things and think about this versus that. I used to do a lot more of that than I do now. But Swamiji's capacity to sort of have things work out, do the right thing, make intuitive choices, take risks that had interesting consequences. At first, I thought he was very clever. He was always figuring things out and had great insight to figure them out. Later, not too much later, but gradually, I began to understand that Swamiji moved in a flow of inspiration. And it was entirely different than what I thought it was. It wasn't that he'd rationalized it all out and seen the consequences. It was that he trusted the inspiration as it came to him. And more specifically, as he himself said, he'd learned to trust it. And there was a particular situation he was involved in with someone, and they were having a lot more trouble with the way the energy was flowing. And Swami just said very simply, well, I'm accustomed to trusting my heart. He said that person hasn't yet learned to do so. And by his heart, he meant his intuitive feelings about things. If this felt like the right decision, he would just make that decision. He didn't need to know where it was going. He wasn't even curious about where it was going. We were involved at one point when we did, it was the Bicentennial Liberty Committee. And we were doing this political action in order to have this planning director, have the Board of Supervisors follow the direction of the grand jury to remove this planning director from her position of responsibility because she was thwarting the development of Ananda. This was in 1976. And Swami just launched this whole campaign. I was integral to helping make it happen. I was his cooperative minion, and I got a number of folks, by my enthusiasm, involved in it. And he created, our actions created certain responses, and then we responded to those conditions, and then new things would happen. And it was quite an interesting unfoldment that ended exactly as it needed to end. When I said to him at the end of it, I said, did you know how this was going to work out? Because I was just doing one thing after another. I didn't have the foggiest idea where we were going. And I said, did you know how this would work out? He said, well, I'm not surprised. And I said, were you calculating it? No, he said, I just followed intuition as it came to me. And that was when I began to really understand that he was operating on a very different level. And it was egoless. He didn't have a point of view. He was just flowing with the energy. Doubt had been obliterated by wisdom. And so he was just able to trust without anxiety. And however it came out, when we were in the middle of this terrible litigation at the end of the 90s, and I've talked and written about it in other places, I don't have to say it here. But we had a bad judge, and our own lawyer was a bad lawyer for us. He wasn't an incompetent lawyer, he was just a terrible lawyer for us. And everything went wrong. And when everything was going wrong, Swami said, the law of averages says that at least a few things will go in your favor. He said, when everything goes against you, you know that Divine Mother is behind it. It's a very interesting way to think about it, isn't it? It wasn't just that it has to go my way for it to be God's will. It just has to happen for it to be God's will. And then one has to, again, intuitively decide what is the proper response. So during the time that everything was going badly, we were putting out a lot of energy to try to make things go better, because Swami had trained us to be dynamic. But you can put out a lot of energy without becoming entangled in the action. Doubt obliterated by wisdom, egoless. Let's see what the exact word is here. Ego-free, no further action can entangle him. Doesn't mean that he doesn't take further action. He just can't be entangled by it. A funny, interesting nuance on this was when Swami Kriyananda was helping to start what became the ashram in San Francisco. And a group of people were there. I sort of tagged along. I volunteered for an assignment that wasn't mine, so I was sort of part of it, but Swami did his best to not let me get too engaged in it because it wasn't really for me to do. I wasn't clear on the concept at the time. And let's see now, oh yes. And Swamiji's pattern, whenever he would give a series of classes, was that he would first give a free lecture. He would interest people in what he had to offer with a free event, and then he would schedule a paid event, and that would draw people into the paid event. He was living in San Francisco, and he was traveling, as far as an hour and a half away from the city in north and south directions. And we scheduled an event that was more than an hour away from where he lived, but we forgot to schedule a free event and just scheduled the first event was a paid class. And Swami drove a long ways to get there, and the turnout was very, very small. And when we were sort of on our way home, somebody with this sort of affirmative voice said, well, I guess Divine Mother just sent the people to the class that she wanted to have there. And Swami looked at the person and said, please leave a little room for human error. Which sort of, put the balance there. Yes, things happened as it ought to, but in that case, not to our credit. And he wanted us to understand that you have to put out dynamic energy. But after you put out dynamic energy, you don't want to get entangled. You don't want to get entangled in the result. You want to just ask the question, what is Divine Mother trying to do? Which included, in this case, that we needed to pay a little more attention and be a little more alert. And that's what she was trying to do in that case. Well, no, chapter 4, verse 42. Arise, therefore, O descendant of Bharata, Arjuna, arise. Take shelter in this greatest science of yoga. Slash to pieces with the sword of wisdom the doubt you feel in your heart as to the nature of the self and of who you are in reality. Wonderful verse, isn't it? Slash to pieces with the sword of wisdom the doubt you feel in your heart as to the nature of the self and of who you are in reality. That's the last verse of chapter 4 of the Gita. Now bear in mind, the whole Gita is a conversation between Arjuna and Krishna on the field of battle, when Arjuna is expected to be the brave warrior that carries the Pandava brothers to victory, and he has quailed. He has hesitated on the eve of battle and is trying to explain to Krishna that this whole fight is a bad idea. And the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna is Krishna telling Arjuna, no, this fight is absolutely essential. And the real fight, of course, is the inner battle between light and darkness, but it's also an epic war. And the Pandavas are the righteous brothers. And again, it's worth emphasizing just in the drama of it, when you know the whole Mahabharata, or at least have read the Mahabharata, the righteous brothers did absolutely everything they could to avoid this head-on conflict and this literal fight to the death with their cousins. But the cousins are unrighteous, and they will destroy the kingdom, and the people of the kingdom will not be served by allowing them to rule. The Pandavas owe it to their people to cast out this false monarchy and take control of it themselves. That's us. We try everything that we can think of to try. We just, what I lovingly call, we test every alternate theory of happiness to see if I can't possibly get happiness by some other method than obliterating my doubts by wisdom. And after we test out all those other theories of happiness, we just realize that surrender to God's will is the only path. And then begins the real battle of Kurukshetra, which is persuading all of the other entities. I don't mean actual disincarnate souls, but mental citizens. That's the phrase Swami uses. We're just a whole city full of mental citizens with varying, extremely different points of view. But we have to take charge of it. And we have to obliterate those dissonant voices until every part of us comes into harmony with God. So it's the same. You see, the Mahabharata is the Pandavas had to destroy every one of the Kauravas, had to just fight to the death against every one of those tendencies that were trying to tell them that happiness would be theirs by some means other than total surrender to God. It's a very exciting story. The Mahabharata is an exciting story. Our little drama, it's a very exciting story. If we could just step that half-inch away and watch it as an extraordinary movie instead of being so involved in it, that every little thing that happens to us personally. Master made the remarkable statement that we are in error when we think that everything that happens to us personally concerns us personally. I've always loved that. Who else would it concern? I mean, your brain just kind of tilts. But once we recognize, here is what he says it, slash to pieces with the sword of wisdom the doubt you feel in your heart as to the nature of the self. In other words, who am I? Once I know who I really am, then I recognize there's no personal to be involved. It's all just a play of light and shadow. And this is the most confusing part to me. It never really happened. I have written a book called Ask Asha. It's an obscure book that nobody knows about, but it's really quite a good book. I highly recommend it. And I answered questions that people asked me. And one of the questions, let me think what it had to do with. It had to do with suffering. And why does God let us suffer? I think that's what the question was. And I just traced out this reflection, which I still find very interesting. If you think that one of your friends betrayed you, and you feel absolutely stricken in your heart, and you're terribly unhappy, and then there's a cascading series of other things that happen because of this initial betrayal, and you suffer in all these different ways. Then you eventually found out that you misunderstood, that your friend never betrayed you. Your friend was always loyal to you. So, what caused your suffering? I mean, what caused it? What caused it was the belief that you were being betrayed. Because you really did suffer. It's not like I didn't feel it. I really felt it. But what I attributed to be the cause never happened. And as all the masters say, when we finally see it from God's point of view, we realize that all of our suffering was just a terrible misunderstanding. That Divine Mother was always blessing us and always taking us to freedom. And what we suffered was self-imposed because we got confused about the plot. I mean, that is a big challenge. I was talking to some friends in the last few days about the law of karma. And they were not as experienced on the path as I am at this point. And I feel this very strongly. The law of karma is a very hard teaching if you really want to embrace it, because it means that everything that happens is fair. And when you look at all the suffering there is in the world and the seeming suffering, the suffering seemingly imposed upon seemingly innocent people, it's a very hard teaching. And I may explain it to people, but I make no effort to convince, because there has to be a deep willingness to confront an extremely challenging truth. And so we take it a step at a time. And I mean, I've had people ask me, I had thus and so experience, do you think it was a karmic experience? You know, I met this person, I had this. Do you think it was a karmic relationship? Well, everything is. Karma means cause and effect. And everything is karma. But it's a very hard teaching. But it's a liberating teaching, because that's how you come to being a Brahmin. That's how you come to the point where I'm not suffering, because everything that happens is the will of God. Everything that happens is exactly fair. Now, see, people get confused by this, because then they say, this person did this terrible thing and it was perfect. No, it was horrible. They got very bad karma for themselves, it's like saying they're going to go to hell for eternity. But I mean, it's not a nice thing to say. They have set into motion the necessity for them to experience what they've imposed on others, to learn what suffering feels like. So it's very unfortunate. It's terribly unfortunate to do that. I mean, there's certain things that have happened with national leaders. The world right now is filled with national leaders who are utterly in it for themselves, who don't have any awareness of the suffering that they're imposing by their decisions. And the highest response is to feel great compassion for them, because they're going to have to suffer. It's not I who curse them, but if a person can impose that kind of suffering, it's an alternate theory of happiness that they're acting out, that I have power, and I can have power over other people, and I can hurt them if I want to, or be indifferent to their hurt. And this is a mistake that has to be straightened out. And the way it's straightened out is that the karma comes back and you get to experience it. You get to find out what it feels like, so that you will understand that I repudiate this as a theory of happiness. Causing pain to others does not bring happiness. It causes pain. So it's not that their actions are perfect in any way. It's that the whole flow of energy will work itself out, because everything ends in bliss. And this is the really hard part. The the suffering that comes into our lives is always there to teach us something we don't know. And I certainly experienced that. When I suffer, it's something I don't know. And I have to learn it. Compassion, kindness, softness, whatever it might be. Or balancing the scale. Every time something has happened where I feel I was mistreated, I don't have any trouble realizing that in the past I treated other people the same way, and now I never would again, because I've experienced it. That's what karma is, unlearned lessons. So now we are on chapter 17 of the book, which is chapter 5 of the Gita, freedom through inner renunciation. So this is a wonderful chapter about what true renunciation is. Chapter 5, verse 1. Arjuna said, "O Krishna, you speak of renouncing action, yet at the same time you recommend it. I would like to know for certain which of these two is the better path." So here, Arjuna has been talking to Krishna this whole time, and Krishna talks about transcending the compelling need to act, but he's telling Arjuna to pick up his bow and arrow and to go out there and go to war. So Arjuna is understandably a little confused. The Blessed Lord answered in verse 2, "Both action and non-action, when rightly understood, lead to salvation. Of the two, however, right action is better." Now Swami starts by explaining that it must be understood that non-action, used in this context, has a different meaning from inaction. So what he's talking about is non-action is when the action doesn't show. And then Swami talks about inaction is when no energy is being put out. Non-action is when the energy is entirely inward and doesn't show in an outward way. When he's talking about right action, he's talking about actions that can be perceived. In other words, acting in this world. Krishna's urging Arjuna to pick up his bow and arrow and engage in the war. He was urging him to right action. And what Arjuna was proposing was inaction, meaning that I don't want to fight. And and Swami starts calling it non-activity, just to make it show. Non-activity means nothing, not participating in the external world, but still being deeply engaged on an inner level. So Swami uses this as an example that a hermit in a cave who spends all his time meditating may appear to be completely, not engaged in any activity. He may appear to be in a state of inaction, but in fact he could be radiating powerful blessings that are in fact uplifting the world. Swami Master had a highly advanced disciple named Rajarsi Janakananda was the name Master gave him. His name was James J. Lin. He was an American. He was Master said he was liberated in this lifetime. He was a free soul. And he spent many, many hours in superconscious states meditating. And he didn't live at Mount Washington until the last years of his life, but he would often visit. He would visit Master often in Encinitas on the ocean. And there was a bluff that overlooked the ocean, and there was a lawn there outside of the hermitage. And Rajarsi was very inspired by nature, by the natural world. And so he would often sit on that bluff on the grass, looking out at the ocean, and then he would go into very high states of consciousness. And Master was walking on the little pathway, a little distance, but near where Rajarsi was meditating. And he'd been talking with his guest, and then he suddenly urged the guest and himself. He said, "Don't speak as we walk by. We mustn't disturb Rajarsi." And then Master said, you have no idea what tremendous blessings are drawn to this work when even one person goes as deeply into meditation as Rajasi does. So Rajasi is just sitting there meditating, but because his spirit was surrendered to God, and because his entire intention was to love and to serve God, the power of the divine was actively flowing through him, and he was blessing everyone. It was an interesting time when I was in Italy with Swamiji on a pilgrimage tour, and we were in some city. It might have been Siena, but I'm not sure. It's not important. And the priest was showing us this holy host, which is the wafer that after it becomes consecrated is the it has the presence of Christ in it. Before it's consecrated, it's just a cracker. After it's confiscated, it becomes a holy item. And this has been verified by great saints who, if you put an unconsecrated wafer in their mouth, they can tell. But if you put a consecrated wafer in, they can tell that it's not material anymore. These are marvelous mysteries of this planet that we live on. So this city had consecrated wafers in the special receptacle in which they're kept, and it's a very holy object. And some low consciousness people stole the container and the wafers. Probably the container was of valuable gold or jewels or something like that. They stole the whole thing. And then the way the priest tells us the story, the whole city prayed for the return of the consecrated wafers because it was such a travesty that our Lord Jesus, which is what they believed the wafer held that consciousness, would be in the hands of brigands. And in some miraculous way, everything was returned. Swami's comment afterwards, he didn't contradict the priest, but later he said, there must have been a great saint praying. He said, you know, even hundreds of people who don't have the capacity to concentrate and really elevate their prayers to a superconscious level, even putting 100 of them together does not equal one superconscious prayer because it just multiplies that same vibration. It was a very interesting comment he made. He wasn't being judgmental, he was just saying that. But one holy person who could genuinely lift their magnetism to a divine level could rearrange the material plane, because the material plane is run from the spiritual level. So Swami just said that, well, there must have been a great saint praying. It was just an interesting comment, and it's the same thing. It's the person of high consciousness may appear to be inactive, but they are profoundly active just on a non-material level. So that's what we're talking about here. So let's see. Now Swami goes into this long conversation about so-called renunciates and what it really means to be. It's this story, you know, this perception that Master points out. And Master said that many of people who renounce the world and go off to the Himalayas to become sadhus, and now they've taken this vow of renunciation, and this is actually a gradual, what you would say, a disintegration of the power of the Swami order that Master spoke to, and Swami felt profoundly inspired by Master to reform. In 2009, Swami created a Nayaswami order. Naya simply means new. A new Swami order in which the idea of renunciation itself was, I shall use the word modernized. It was brought more from Kali Yuga, more into Dwapara Yuga. And the Kali Yuga concept of things, it's a matter of rules, it's a matter of form, it's a matter of what it looks like. And Adi Shankaracharya, who reorganized the Swami order some many centuries ago, Swami actually interestingly says that he believes that Master himself was Adi Shankaracharya. I went, when I was on my way up to Badrinath, which is this extraordinary temple high in the Himalayas, we stopped at a city called Josimath. Josimath was the ashram of Adi Shankaracharya. And there was a cave there where he used to meditate. And it was very interesting to me because if Master was Adi Shankaracharya, it's likely that Swami was there. In fact, Swami knows that he was there. If Swami was there, it's likely that the rest of us were there. But when I went to that ashram for the first time, I didn't know anything about it. And, you know, who knows what these feelings are. But I just went to it because there'd been a landslide and the road was blocked. And we were stuck in Josimath for an extra 24 hours. And I was helping to lead this pilgrimage tour, and we had to do something. And, Adi Shankaracharya's ashram is here. Let's go see it. So, I mean, that's about how much relationship I had to it. As soon as I stepped on that property, I became very, very happy. And I mean, it wasn't just like I was happy to be there, but there was just something about that place that was very home-like to me in a very, very positive way. And meditating in the cave where Adi Shankaracharya had meditated, it was just remarkable. Well, anyway, so it was interesting to me because Swami took it upon himself to reform the order that Adi Shankaracharya had started. And if that had been done by Master, and Swami was here to fulfill Master's next, or this incarnation of the same jiva, who's here to establish all this for Dwapara Yuga, how interesting that Swami would pick up this. Because Master said that, many of those who become sadhus, therefore they renounce work, they renounce involvement in the world, they renounce handling of money, they renounce owning things. But Master said too many of them do not have the capacity to replace that activity with the inner activity of deep meditation. I mean, you can put all that work aside and all those responsibilities aside, but you have to replace them with equal or more energy. You can't just remove them and replace them with nothing. So what Master says, and he says it rather bluntly, first, physical inactivity causes them to become physically lazy. Physical laziness leads to mental laziness. Mental laziness leads to spiritual laziness. And Master said, many of the sadhus are nothing but bums. Now, I wouldn't have the right to say that, but Master did say that. Master did say that the act of renunciation and becoming a Swami is being misunderstood. The mere act of doing that and putting aside these other duties does not make you free. Too often, it just lowers your consciousness rather than raising it. This is why Krishna says that right action is better, because right action is safer. Right action is more likely to expand your energy and raise your consciousness, where just assuming a lack of activity will result in spiritual growth is simply not true. Because if you think about the 8 manifestations of the divine, which is that's 9, this is 8 manifestations of the divine, that's what it is to be an instrument of God. Merely to not own things doesn't make you an instrument of God. Love, peace, calmness, joy, energy, light, sound, wisdom. And you have to be manifesting, and one of them is energy. Master puts it forth as power. But if you're not manifesting in some way, some aspect of all of these, then you can't just paste it on from the outside. And too often, if we relinquish responsibilities, before we have a corresponding ability to put out just that much energy on a higher level, then we don't succeed. When I was a young brahmacharini, and there was a group of us as brahmacharini, Swami talked to us, I remember at one time, about how much energy and selfless commitment it takes for a woman to raise a child. He was talking to a group of women, and what to speak of giving birth to a child, the pregnancy, the physical sacrifice or devotion that a woman's body shows to give birth to a child, and then all the effort that it takes to raise a child. He said, don't think by remaining unmarried and not having children that therefore you get to escape that selfless necessity. He said, free as you are from that kind of personal responsibility, you need to put out all that energy and much more for the good of the world. It's very simple. It's very obvious. Most people are drawn to have children because it gives them the opportunity. Of course, the opportunity may be imposed upon them, but it creates the necessity for selfless, dedicated output of energy. And selfless, dedicated output of energy has the potential, at least, to help us develop spiritually and raise our consciousness. It's not automatic. You can be ego-entangled completely in any activity. You can be a priest and be utterly ego-entangled. But it gives you at least the possibility, because at least you don't become lazy. So, and then Swami goes on even to talk about this more, and these are very important clarifying points. And this is again in the Indian tradition, where the monks, the sadhus, because they don't work, they depend on the charity of others in order to eat, in order to live. When India was a more intact society, the whole system worked very in a very orderly manner. The householders would take care of the renunciates because it was good karma for them to serve those who were serving God. But Swami said, as the confusion has set in, often the monks look down upon those they call the householders because they're so entangled in samsara. They're so entangled in the ups and downs of the world, they say, because they are not formally renunciates. But the renunciates are perfectly willing to take the fruits of the householder's effort. You can work, you can earn money, you can buy food and give the food to me, but I'm going to disdain you for what you're doing. Swami just says, it doesn't lead to spiritual freedom, it leads to spiritual arrogance. And none of this is wholesome. And then Swami moves from the Himalayas and the Indian sadhus, and he moves over to Western monasticism, because, as Master said, ignorance is pretty evenly divided, East and West. It's not just one side. Human nature is just human nature. So then Swami takes on the whole question of obedience. And the way, on the Indian side, the sadhu, the Swami order, it's individual. And of course, there are monasteries, and there where people, ashrams, I mean, where sadhus may congregate. But the entire idea of being a sannyasi, the way the Adi Shankaracharya order was set up, any one Swami can initiate another person into sannyas. When Swami created the Nayaswami order, he said that three Swamis must agree that this person should be initiated rather than just one-to-one. And because Swami also allowed that married couples can become Swamis together, he said those three must be unrelated to each other. So it can't just be a married couple plus one. And Swami did that to keep the discrimination a little more broad. So that, because just one person might have reasons that are too subjective for agreeing to an initiation, but three together are more likely to be able to be dispassionate and think carefully about the appropriateness of it. But in any case, in the West, it's very rare. Hermits are very rare, and wandering sadhus are just not part of our culture. So if an individual wants to renounce the world, the way they've always done it is to go into a monastery. And for many, many centuries, it's been the Catholic monastic order has set the tone. And what has happened in the Catholic monastic order is this concept of the monastic superior. Swami puts the word in quotes and describes it as a very unfortunate word because superior does not inherently mean spiritually superior. It just means higher up than you are in the organization. And unfortunately, organizational position does not necessarily confer wisdom. It may confer power, but it does not necessarily confer wisdom. And for various reasons, the concept of being obedient to your superiors has become so centralized in the monastic ideal. Now, nowadays, none of this plays the part in society that it has played for centuries, because we're moving out of Kali into Dwapar. And for all the reasons that Swami's describing here, this way of thinking is not a good idea. Master says to discipline yourself to a person of realization is one thing. To discipline yourself to someone who merely has an institutional position over you, he said, instead of strengthening you spiritually, it can actually weaken you. He says it's very bad. And yet, in monastic orders, those who absolutely obey are held up to be the best ones, because in theory, you see, what you're doing is you're overcoming the ego. But you're not really overcoming it, except in rare cases, you're merely suppressing it. And in the course of suppressing it, you lose contact with your own wisdom, talking about the 8 manifestations of God, with your own ability to discriminate. And, you know, Swamiji never minces words. I mean, one of the things that Swami is willing to do, he's willing to state what he feels unequivocally. Just like Master said, too many sadhus are just bums. And if that was the truth, he just said it. He wasn't judging. He was just saying what it was. And Swami writes here, let's see how it goes. He says, obedience under such circumstances, which is when you have a superior who's not spiritually wise, may be perceived to be good for the community, the monastic community, but the consequences for the individual himself, these were my own Guru's words, is actually to weaken his will. The stock answer given in monasteries is, if your superior is wrong in what he asks you to do, God will correct him. Swami says, indeed. And then he goes on to say, I have never seen this bit of monastic wisdom justified in real life. It's a very strong statement. And, you know, toward the end of Swami's involvement in the ashram, Master started, on more than one occasion, he was subject to that kind of obedience, because that monastery formed around this Kali Yuga idea. And monastic superiors would tell you had to do something out of obedience. And Swami, from first-hand experience, just never saw it to be a good idea. When he established, not the Nayaswami order, but years before that, Ananda itself formed a monastic order. It was called the Sevaka order. Oddly enough, the original incentive for it was that we could save a lot of money in taxes. I love that. It was because of Caesar asking us to render unto Caesar what belonged to him. But we were a monastic order. We just didn't fit the conventional model, but we were a monastic order in every way that counted, and we actually were recognized by the IRS as a monastic order. But we have householders, and in that order, even families with children, the parents can be a member of the monastic order. So Swami had to write a vow for us. And what he came up with was cooperative obedience, because he says equally, it's foolish to think that you know better than those who have been on the path longer than you, that have demonstrated their understanding of the spiritual path as a mere affirmation of your individual freedom. He says it's folly to assert your will against those who have demonstrated that they understand more deeply than you do. And this is the difference. It's not just a question of I have a position, you have to listen. It's that I choose to listen to you because my free will and my discrimination tell me that you have something genuine to offer me, and I'm eager to learn it. But cooperative means that there's two sides to it. You know, my point of view also counts, and I will listen to yours. And we are a path of discipleship, speaking of Ananda, so you recognize that spiritual growth is progressive. You recognize that spiritual understanding is directional. And therefore it's not that one has to listen, it's that one would want to listen. And in many other places, Swami talks about it. After decades of experience with devotees seeking God realization, he observes that those who make the most progress, among other characteristics, this is only one, is those who are eager to learn from and attune themselves to those who have been on the path longer and have shown that they're more advanced. And Swami's responsibility is given to devotees who demonstrate the right characteristics to have it. But position does not automatically confer power. It confers responsibility. But if the magnetism is there, then everything else follows. That was years and years ago. People at Ananda are very independent-minded. Years ago, I was working on a project, and there was a woman who was very capable and had many good ideas, but she had what Swami lovingly called an unfortunate manner. And her unfortunate manner made people not eager to solicit her opinion. And it was very frustrating for her because she actually had a lot to offer, but because of her unfortunate manner, people tried to avoid dealing with her rather than seeking her out. And I was the organizer of the project, and this woman was frustrated, and she wanted me to make a rule that, that this piece of work, it all had to go through her. She had to approve it before I could go on to the next stage. I said I could make every rule in the world. I could tattoo it on people's arms. I could post it on the wall. I promise you, if they don't find you helpful, they'll never consult you. In other words, you have to put out the magnetism. And if you put out the magnetism of helping them make the project better, because everyone wants to make it better, then they'll come to you. And when Swami was talking about the Nayaswami order and the institutional positions, just looking generations ahead, he said, let the magnetism determine it. He even put it, he said, even though we need one spiritual director for Ananda worldwide, he said, it's not going to be necessarily true, as the generations develop, that the person who holds that responsibility will necessarily be the most spiritually advanced person in the whole of the Ananda family. And he said people will go where they find inspiration, but those responsibilities need to be carried out by someone, and the example that person sets will help strengthen everything. But position is not the same as spiritual magnetism. And so he speaks very strongly against this monastic idea. So let me see. And then he talks about the whole concept of householders. And he talks about how silly it is because many householders don't actually hold houses. And he says, and many sadhus have signed their name to a deed and actually own a house. He said, and he just, he talks about how often, how does he put it, both monastics and sadhus, because they don't put enough of the right kind of energy out, as he put it, as the years pass, they diminish, instead of becoming more magnetic and more powerful. And, Swami mentioned this when he was in Italy, in Rome, and saw so many, lifelong monastics. And Swami just put it, I wish I saw more of them with eyes shining with God realization. He said, I wanted to see God realization shining from their eyes. And it was a great sadness to me that I saw so few. You know, even people who come in with tremendous youthful zeal, but they don't have yoga, they don't meditate, or they're sadhus, and they've renounced activity before they should have renounced it, before they had the energy to renounce it in the right way. And so it was a very interesting point, you know, and for this reason, Master said, and he wrote this in the first edition of Autobiography of a Yogi. It was edited to mean something else, but in the first edition, Master said, you know, the man who lives the ordinary life in the world, however Master described those words, provided he keeps, you know, an egoic non-involvement, that path is actually the higher path. Because I don't have to renounce. I can just live in the world and transcend it. So neither living in the world nor renouncing the world ensures spiritual growth. The only thing that ensures spiritual growth is attunement and receptivity to God. And the safer path is to remain active, because it's too easy to shrink. And Swami talks about the greatest flaw of the monastic obedience, he said, is because it's too often it is a shifting of responsibility for my spiritual welfare off of my shoulders onto yours. If my monastic superior asks me to do it, and I do it, even if it's wrong, even if it's stupid, even if I know it's not good for me, it's his fault now, not mine. And Swami says there's no spiritual responsibility, rests entirely upon us. And this is where Master's bringing of Kriya Yoga to America, the technique of Kriya, which allows every individual to develop to the extent that they're willing to dedicate themselves. And it's not just the technique, it's the whole story of Kriya Yoga, discipleship to a line of masters, devotion, service. But the total practice of Kriya Yoga, as Master taught it, including and centered upon the act of inner communion through meditation, puts spiritual responsibility in the only place it can be held, which is into the hands of the devotee. There's no intermediary. The spiritual community can help. Those who are more advanced can help. Other disciples can really help you. But it's what we do with what is offered to us that makes the difference. Nothing is automatic. I can't merely renounce the world and know I'm going to advance. I can't merely take the habit, the meaning, you know, the vocation of a monastic, and automatically, nothing is automatic. It's precisely in our hands. That's the good news. That's the extraordinary freedom and the divine potential of it. This is what Krishna is trying to tell us. This is the life that Dwapara Yuga provides. It's a breakdown of the idea that form will create inner realization. And it's the understanding that only inner realization will make me free. God bless you, my friends.